afternoon, Judge Cammer.
Good afternoon, Judge Dougherty.
Thank you for coming to participate in our interviews to commemorate the 40th anniversary of the Housing Court. I guess we should start with a little bit of your background. I know that you were my supervising judge, in 1997, maybe 1998. But I'm sure you had more experience with Housing Court other than when you came to New York County to run things.
Well, my experience, start again. I started out as a housing court attorney. My first job out of law school was at Legal Services, at Bed-Stuy Legal Services. And there I did primarily housing work. And I was there for a year. And after that, I left and went into private practice with my then supervisor at Bed-Stuy Legal Services and two other attorneys from Bed-Stuy Legal Services, and we formed Cammer, Carlson, Dallow, and Parkerton, which was a very fancy name for a brand new firm. And our specialty was housing. And I did housing as a private practitioner until I became a judge. So I did that for 10 years.
Okay, now, when you were a practitioner, had the specialized housing part already been formed by the legislature, or were you dealing with the old days with civil court judges and...
I was admitted into the bar in February of 1972.
Okay.
And at that point, and our practice, I was in Brooklyn.
Mm-hmm.
And at that point, the civil court part of housing was in a exceedingly old building, which ultimately was condemned. And it was consisted of civil court judges.
And then I believe the legislation was 1973 that, created the housing part of the civil court, and that there were then judges designated as housing court judges to sit in parts and to make rulings. Is that primarily where you practiced when you were?
That is primarily where I practiced, but I have to say the location may have changed, but the accommodations remain dismal. My memory of
Brooklyn. If you're talking about Brooklyn, I'm sure it's still no good.
My memory of it was that they were little warren of rooms
Mm-hmm.
within the main building at 141 Livingston Street, but they were horrendous. I don't remember Manhattan being particularly spectacular either with the housing court, and the Bronx was in the basement. So, as I said, locations may have changed,
Right, well,
but accommodations did not.
Certainly during the formation, the housing court didn't get any priority as to the spaces allocated to the volume of people expected to use it. So you weren't really involved in the formation, but you did practice there?
I was a practitioner.
Okay, and how do you observe the housing court? Do you think it's been effective over the years?
I think in certain ways, it's definitely effective in the sense that it's a specialized court. It's got trained judges. It was a big step up to have judges who actually had a sense about what the law was when the housing court first came into existence, as opposed to by chance with the civil court judges who may or may not have had as much experience and knowledge as the housing court judges did. I would say that. I would say from the outset there has been a ongoing problem with the housing court which has never been addressed, which is that 90% of the people who appear in housing court are unrepresented from the tenant side, and on the landlord side, most landlords are represented, and there's an inequality, an inherent inequality in that has never been remedied.
Over the years, obviously, they have changed the way the court operates. There was the initiative that was implemented, I think, in 1997.
I think.
And it sort of made the housing parts a little bit more specialized. They allocated additional resources and adding additional court attorneys to try to conference and go over settlements with primarily unrepresented litigants. Do you think that is there something more that can be done?
It's something more that needs to be done,
Yeah.
which is
Well,
to address.
People talk about Gideon and that everybody should have an attorney, and
I
certainly it would make matters matters a lot easier for the judges trying to,
There's no question from a
Move
judge's
calendar.
point of view, having two attorneys in front of you is very different and much more pleasurable than having one unrepresented litigant or even two unrepresented litigants. So from the standpoint of the bench, there's no question about it. From the standpoint of the litigant, there's also no question about it.
some of the discussion that we've had in the committee talking about the housing court and its history is that the legislation, the enabling legislation for housing court basically talked about the primary function of the court to preserve the housing stock.
Right.
And there were many that feel that the primary purposes of the housing court is to be the landlord's rent collection agency. Do you think that the housing court falls on either side? Do you think it's been effective as far as the mandate concerning the housing stock and keeping after landlords to maintain their properties and to provide essential services to tenants?
I think it's certainly tried. Whether it succeeded, I'm not as convinced, but I think there's certainly been an effort to recognize that purpose of the law.
Right. Did you have any experience with the HP part, which is the
I
specialized
did.
part?
I sat in the HP part.
Do you think it was effective?
I also practiced in the HP part.
Do you think it was an effective part to get the right results for the parties?
I don't think it. I think it did not as much as one would hope. It didn't. It doesn't, and is not able to do what needs to be done. A lack of resources
I
plays
was about to say, do you
each
think
part.
part of it is the fact that there have been such budgetary cuts with HPD that they don't have sufficient staffing to bring enforcement cases, to send out battalions of inspectors, to go after landlords for failing to certify the correction of violations?
I think that plays a significant part.
Mm-hmm. Do you think the Housing Court Initiative had any impact on the practice in housing court?
I was involved in the initiative in the sense that I was the supervising judge in Manhattan when it was put in, and a lot of my understanding of the initiative was to address the problem of how cases moved, and a lot of emphasis was placed on the fact that the halls of housing court became the place where, in fact, that was where the practice was occurring.
Where all the business took place.
Right, and that was, to my mind, a primary reason for the implementation. I think the extra resources was excellent. I don't think it addressed that, frankly. I think when you go back, the halls are just as crowded today. It's actually distressing. You go back, you think, okay, you've done something, and it turns out nothing. The more things change, the more they remain the same. So I think that effectiveness is not as effective as one would have hoped.
What other changes did you observe during the past 40 years?
I'm going back. I mean, it sounds like a broken record, but the changes that really, as far as I'm concerned, that would matter to making the court a true court and an effective court are two. One is having the accommodations so that when you're walking into that court, you know you're in a court. And that does not happen. You walk into federal court, you know you're in federal court. You walk in even to Supreme Court, you know you're in a real court. Less so than federal court, but you still know that when you're in state Supreme. You walk into housing court, and you do not know that. And that is perception matters, and so does the reality for the litigants, for the judges, for how one feels when being in the court. And the second part is that in terms of its effectiveness, unless and until people have adequate access to representation, it's an inherently unequal bargaining position, and it's too much of a burden on the court, it's too much on the litigants, and until that's addressed, I'm not sure that we'll have an effective court.
Is there any suggestions that you would make as to how to make the court better, other than what you've basically
Always
said
resources.
about it?
Resources. From the barest resources, which is having copy machines, having, making sure that that judges, the bench have, information. I know that there's a push on that, and that's been ongoing for a long time. But in any event, adequate resources from that, and then information, of course. Since my dream of adequate representation, the efforts that are being done to provide as much information in as clear a way as possible. Well, I actually had an interesting experience, which is that after I was elected, which was in 1980, I was elected in 82, but I started in 83. My first year I was in criminal court. The second year I came to civil court. And I sat in a part where I had a trial, and I had a wonderful court officer named John Sledge. I don't know if you remember him. Wonderful guy. And at the end of the trial, I ruled in favor of the tenant. This is absolutely true. I ruled in favor of the tenant, and I dismissed the petition. So I turned to John, and I said, I need a judgment in favor of the tenant. And he said, we don't have a judgment in favor of the tenant. And I said, there must be one somewhere. This cannot be the first time in history. In any event, he left. And he was gone for probably a half hour, and he came back with a judgment in favor of the tenant. So I think that answers your question.